afternoon. I wish you all a happy 2025. I hope that your new year has started in a wonderful way and that will continue to be the case for you throughout this entire year. I was trying to find some fun facts for the first meeting of the year today, and the one that appealed to me most is that today is National Chocolate Covered Cherry Day. So if you still have some left from your stocking, enjoy those today. I would like to welcome Nancy Carlson Dodd up to give our invocation today.
Please bow your heads if you wish. Eternal Father, lift us above life's anxieties and irritations into your serenity and peace. With your patience that bears with us, mercy that forgives us, and love that sustains us, give us grateful hearts. Thank you so much for the bounty of our land. Please be with us as we continue our quest for knowledge. Amen.
I will introduce Kory Klosterman. Today he is giving his paper on governing supermajorities, consequences and effects. A native of Salina, Ohio, Kory earned his Bachelor of Arts degree from Ohio University and his Certified Financial Planner certification from the Louisiana State University E.J. Uso School of Business. Kory has had a financial planning practice with Edward Jones since 2015. Prior to that, he was a vice president in retail banking management at J.P. Morgan Chase. He and his wife Marcella have one dog, Coda, and two cats, Bengo and Zoe. Things that you may not know about Kory are that he is a regular backpacker and started a backpacking ministry at his church, and that he is an indoor gardening nerd and grows tomatoes, peppers, onions, ginger, strawberries, celery, salad greens, and potatoes indoors all year round. I think that's pretty neat. And also, Kory and Marcella recently started learning pickleball. So if you have tips on that for him, I'm sure he would love those. This is Kory's second quest paper. Welcome, Kory.
I would like to start with a story. A few years ago, I was asked to join one of the most hated political organizations in the modern era, an HOA board. My fellow neighbors asked me to be treasurer, so I conveniently told them that I'd love to help, but my business and financial planning and related compliance measures would create a conflict of interest. This approach did not have the desired effect. They told me that they were glad I wanted to help, would find a different treasurer, and then create another opening for me. Your first takeaway from this talk: don't take negotiation advice from me. So I joined the board, and for the first time since moving in the neighborhood, I actually read the neighborhood covenants. In fact, the entire board spent some time reviewing it, and the entire thing was really a mess. It's a cookie-cutter set of covenants from the 1970s that mention lakes and common areas that don't exist, and numerous sections that were far more restrictive than we felt reasonable. For example, and I quote, "No boat, motorhome, camping or other trailer, or other equipment or machinery of any kind shall be kept on any lot." How long can something be somewhere before it is kept there? Also, what really is other equipment? Fortunately, a great local attorney was also a board member and offered to revise and update our HOA free of charge. However, it was another part of the covenants that would be the insurmountable obstacle to our ability to modernize it. I quote again, "These protective covenants, restrictions, and limitations may be changed or abolished in whole or in part, and at any time, by the written agreement of all the owners of at least 85% of the lots in the addition." I don't know how many of you have ever had the great joy of being involved in your HOA, but the likelihood of us ever getting to 85% of our 60% or 60 plus residents to provide written approval to change the covenants was and is impossibly low. The result of this single line, added with a noble intent to disallow a simple majority from making major changes to our covenant, has instead had the effect of making any change nearly impossible due to an exceptionally high threshold. Thomas Edison once wrote that a good intention with a bad approach often leads to a poor result. Welcome to my talk this afternoon, Governing Supermajorities, Consequences and Effects. Today, we encounter supermajority rules in far more elements of our lives than we may initially realize. As my prior story illustrates, purchasing a home in a residential community can lead to being bound by covenants, rules, and regulations enforced by community associations and secured by rigorous supermajority rules. The school boards that oversee our children's education are often required to use a supermajority rule for issues including the choice to discontinue use of a textbook or the standardization of equipment or supplies. And our children's athletic clubs may have their bylaws subject to a supermajority amendment clause. University professors often encounter supermajority rules at many levels, from the initial hiring of faculty to tenure decisions and other decisions made by the Board of Trustees. Employees of other corporations, both nonprofit and for-profit, abide by decisions implemented by corporate boards that use supermajority rules for governance. If these norms are common in our private and associative lives, they are nearly ubiquitous in the political realm. In the United States, on both the state and federal levels, laws are regularly subject to supermajority rules for enactment and rescission. In 16 states, supermajorities are required to raise taxes. In the Senate, the use or threat of filibuster requiring a 3/5 vote for cloture has risen dramatically in recent years. Constitutions around the globe most inevitably have recourse to supermajority rules for adoption and amendment. These norms have profound consequences for the justice of the political universe in which we live. My hope today is to provide a few interesting bits of information and, if possible, even encourage a few questions about this unique aspect of democracies to consider and meditate on well after I've wrapped up this talk. I certainly do not have all the answers. Going in, I would like to share a quick thought on the topic of governing supermajorities versus supermajorities as a broader topic. Taken literally, the topic governing supermajorities, consequences and effects could lean heavily into the results of governing as a supermajority. I spent time trying to write that paper, yet I consistently ran into the issue of defining what a supermajority is in that context. For example, will Republicans hold a supermajority control of the U.S. government next year by having all three branches? Is a dictatorship or a single-party government a form of supermajority rule? To alleviate that problem, I chose to take the approach of discussing the consequences and effects of supermajority rules on the governed more so than those doing the governing. Hopefully that doesn't completely dash your expectations and ruin your lunch. That all said, we'll start with the basics. What does the term supermajority even mean? Then we'll get into the philosophy behind requiring supermajorities and the history of their use in politics. From there, we'll go a bit deeper into the consequences and effects of using them within our political system. Let's start with those basics. In a general sense, there are three ways a community can make decisions together. The first is by unanimous decision. Man, I'm going to screw this word up every time, guys. Unanimity rule. It's only once in this talk. I got rid of it everywhere else. Everyone agrees on the same thing. Wonderful in concept, but impractical in reality. Another option, of course, is majority rule. 50% plus 1. Far more effective at leading to action, but it can have its own problems. In between the two is a supermajority. A supermajority requires a larger than simple majority, more than 50%, to approve decisions. This threshold, often set at 2/3, 3/5, 3/4, or 85%, is meant to ensure that important decisions have broader societal consensus and support. Supermajority rules are deeply embedded in the decision-making processes of many democracies, especially in legislative, constitutional, and institutional contexts. This talk explores how these rules are designed to achieve certain goals, such as ensuring legitimacy, fostering political stability, and protecting minority interests. At the same time, during our journey today, we will also find that supermajorities often create unintended consequences that hinder democratic responsiveness and can exacerbate political polarization. Okay, we all now know what a supermajority is. Let's take a brief moment to talk about background so we can get a better understanding of how they fit in today's political landscape. The earliest decision-making was by group consent, through approval of a community rather than various people within it. However, this approach provided no mechanism for overcoming disagreement. This prompted a shift to voting that started with Greece adopting democratic rule following the Athenian Revolution around 500 BCE. Of course, once it was determined that votes should be counted, the question arose as to what sort of majority should be required to authorize action. Almost 400 years after Athens adopted democracy, around 100 BCE, we see the first historical record of supermajority governance with the Roman Assembly. However, supermajorities came to real prominence during the 12th century as a result of religious elections. Voters would come together during religious elections as a means of expressing the will of God. This might suggest a perfect application of unanimous rule, but in practice, internal divisions and rogue actors made this impractical. The result of this led to a determination to employ supermajority rules, including the requirement for a two-thirds majority rule for the election of Pope. That two-thirds rule for the papal enclave exists to this very day. Since the 18th century, supermajority rule has solidified its place in most modern democratic systems. Supermajoritarianism? It's going to be that type of day. Elevate the quality of citizen decisions by ensuring adequate deliberation, a factor that has been particularly crucial in contexts in which the consequences of one choice were far graver than the consequences of the other choice. For example, in jury deliberations in a criminal trial. Supermajority rule has demonstrated its usefulness in stabilizing institutions, ensuring broad-based consensus for important changes, and protecting vulnerable minorities. So now that we've defined what a supermajority is, and we know a little bit about where they came from, let's explore briefly why they exist. What are the philosophical justifications for supermajority rules? At a fundamental level, the objective of institution supermajority requirements is the idea of balancing the will of the majority with the protection of minority interests. Key justifications for majority rules include the legitimacy of decision-making. Supermajority rules are intended to enhance the legitimacy of decisions by ensuring they represent a broader consensus. Preventing hasty decisions. Supermajorities can help prevent hasty or impulsive decisions that may be popular in the short term, but harmful in the long run. And the protection of minority rights. Supermajority rules are seen as a tool to protect minority views by making it harder for a temporary majority to impose its will on the minority. We'll get a bit deeper into these key reasons and more a bit later. The takeaway for now is that all these arguments are fairly compelling in theory. However, in practice, supermajority rules can create their own set of problems, especially in highly polarized political environments. How do we navigate the competing advantages and disadvantages of a topic like supermajorities? There is, in fact, an entire field of study on it, and it's called social choice theory. Social choice theory is a study of political aspects such as supermajority voting. It is a branch of welfare economics that extends the theory of rational choice to collective decision-making. Now, if you're like me, you're like, what is welfare economics? Welfare economics is a field of economics that applies macroeconomic techniques to evaluate the overall well-being of society. In its broadest sense, social choice theory is a study of collective decision-making. Given a group and some need to make a collective decision, how should the group decide what to do? In this sense, social choice has been firmly on the agenda of political theory going back as far as Aristotle's Politics. Social choice theory contrasts with political science in that it's a normative field that studies how society could or possibly should make good decisions, whereas political science is a descriptive field that observes how societies actually make decisions. Real-world examples of social choice rules include constitutions, parliamentary procedures for voting on laws, as well as electoral systems. Because of this, the field is occasionally called voting theory. We could go really deep here. It is mind-boggling how much time and effort has gone into imagining and reimagining and reimagining the best systems for governance. Social choice theory is this massive and exceptionally complicated subfield of political economy studies that has done an exceptional job of proving through excessively complicated formulas that democratic politics is incapable of bringing together voters' preferences in a way that's both fair and coherent. I'm telling you, it's really great reading to brighten your mood on a cloudy winter day. Today, we won't be going much further down that rabbit hole, with the exception of one aspect, called May's theorem. The theorem was first published by Kenneth May in 1952. May's theorem is also called the general possibility theorem, and it outlines 3 democratic principles. The first is decisiveness. The voting rule must specify a unique decision, even if the decision is indifference, for any set of individual preferences. We need to know that we're deciding on something and what it is, right? 2, anonymity. Oh, that word. A voting rule must treat all voters alike in the sense that if 2 voters traded ballots, the outcome of the election must remain the same. And 3, neutrality. A voting rule must treat all options alike rather than favor one over the other. This is a formal statement of May's theorem. The point is it can get pretty complicated. That's okay though, because this talk today is about the effects of supermajorities, not social choice theory. So why do I bring it up? I wanted to introduce you to May's theorem because before we speak to the more practical consequences and effects of supermajorities, I think it's worthwhile to take just a moment to engage with the philosophical question that this theorem raises. A supermajority vote can satisfy principle number 1, decisiveness, as it should be fairly straightforward to identify a unique decision. It can also satisfy principle number 2, anonymity. Guys, I can normally pronounce these words, promise. Anonymity, simply by having an anonymous vote. What about principle number 3, though? That all options must be treated equally. Whereas supermajority is required, the vote is weighted, sometimes quite heavily, towards the default option. An example would be my HOA covenants, right? This can create a fairly strong bias towards the judgment of prior generations over time, or over our own, rather. If a fair democratic process requires that all options be approached equally, then requiring a supermajority vote sure seems to fall well short of that standard. I feel this is important, enough at least to include in this talk, because before we go into all the consequences and effects of supermajorities, and there are a lot, we must ask ourselves what our goal is. If our goal is to have the most democratic system, I believe there is a compelling argument here that supermajorities simply aren't that. However, if we're willing to accept a system that is potentially more fair at the cost of being less democratic, supermajorities can be a solution. Bottom line, while important to consider, philosophical theorems about voting don't necessarily translate to real-world practical results. So let's get into some of those real-world effects of supermajority rule. At this point, we know that the consequences of supermajority governance has both advantages and disadvantages. Let's break them down. One of the key benefits of supermajority requirements is that they help ensure stability and legitimacy. By demanding broad support, supermajorities create decisions that feel more solid. They reflect a wider, more representative consensus. This has obvious advantages, especially when we're dealing with decisions that have long-term implications, like constitutional amendments or significant policy shifts. The U.S. Constitution is one of the most prominent examples where a supermajority is required for change. To amend the Constitution, many of you know, 2/3 of both the House of Representatives and the Senate must vote in favor, and then the amendment must be ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures or conventions. It's a pretty high bar. However, the flip side of that stability is a potential for gridlock. As you all know, reaching a supermajority isn't easy, especially in highly polarized environments. The high threshold can sometimes be more of an obstacle than a safeguard. You can end up with situations where nothing gets done because it's so hard to reach that supermajority, like an 85% approval for a homeowner association. I'm not bitter about that, guys, I promise. Another advantage of supermajority requirements is their protection against majoritarian tyranny. In theory, requiring a supermajority ensures that decisions represent a more broadly supported consensus, preventing the majority from pushing through policies that marginalizes smaller groups. It's a check against decisions that could have disproportionately negative effects on minority groups or outliers. The system guards against radical shifts that might not stand the test of time, preserving the integrity of key institutional frameworks. That said, the safeguard against the majority rule can also go too far. Minority factions can exploit the supermajority requirements to block progress, even when a proposal has significant support from the majority. In many political systems, this dynamic is a source of frustration. A well-coordinated minority can hold up essential legislation or reforms simply by leveraging the supermajority threshold. It's a paradox. A system designed to prevent tyranny of the majority can, in practice, enable tyranny of the minority. On a more positive side, supermajority requirements can promote compromise and collaboration. If you need more than just a simple majority to pass a decision, you're forced to bring in people from across ideological or political spectrum. This leads to broader coalitions and, ideally, more moderate policies that reflect a wide range of interests. This can foster a more inclusive approach to decision-making, leading to policies that are more likely to have broad public support in the long run. The downside, of course, is that this drive for compromise often leads to weaker, more diluted decisions. The very need to build a broad coalition can water down proposals, stripping them of the boldness or effectiveness they might have had in their original form. Compromise might be great for avoiding conflict, but it's not always the recipe for meaningful change. On a more positive note, supermajorities can act as a check on hasty decisions. They force a deeper level of scrutiny and prevent significant changes from being made impulsively or without adequate support. This is especially valuable for decisions that could have far-reaching consequences, whether constitutional amendments or the adoption of high-stakes policies. The built-in delay of needing a supermajority can give more time for reflection, discussion, and debate, and encourages careful thought and consideration before embarking on potentially risky changes. A major problem, however, is that supermajority requirements can make timely change extremely difficult, especially in moments of crisis. When speed is essential, the supermajority threshold can be an impediment. If a critical issue arises and swift action is needed, the slow, deliberative process that supermajorities require can hinder urgent responses. In the case of a financial crisis, a natural disaster, or a global health emergency, decision-making processes can be bogged down by the difficulty of achieving a supermajority. Urgency and consensus don't always go hand in hand, and this tension is a serious flaw when quick action is required. In terms of voter engagement, requiring a supermajority or adjusting the need for a supermajority has a record of increasing voter participation. People may feel that their votes matter more in these cases, leading to greater turnout. One example. In August of 2013, Ohio voters rejected Issue 1, which would have required a 60% supermajority to amend the state constitution. Despite being an off-year election held in August, the issue was soundly defeated with an exceptionally high turnout of over 3 million voters casting ballots. The flip side of that, of course, repeated votes requiring supermajority thresholds can lead to voter fatigue, especially if the bar seems too high or voters feel their vote won't make a difference. This can result in disengagement and decreased turnout. This is particularly common in systems with multiple veto points, where complexity and difficulty of reaching a supermajority can result in decreased turnout and frustration of process. A less discussed benefit is that supermajorities can actually act as a bulwark against extremism. When you need broader support for a decision, it can force leaders and decision makers to move towards the center, making extreme or partisan proposals harder to pass. The more votes required, the more likely you are to get policies that are moderate and that balance competing interests. Ironically, supermajorities can also exacerbate polarization. In highly divided systems, the process to gather enough support for a supermajority can lead to more polarized outcomes. In practice, political actors may focus on rallying their most extreme supporters instead of seeking common ground. This is one of the paradoxes of supermajority requirements. While they are intended to foster cooperation, they can end up fueling division. Finally, we should address the complexity and increased costs of achieving a supermajority. The longer and more convoluted the process, the more resources are spent on negotiating, lobbying, and reaching consensus. This can make the decision-making process much more expensive, whether we're talking about time, money, or political capital. The complexity also introduces a level of uncertainty. Negotiations can drag on, decisions get delayed, and the process itself becomes a major source of friction. Okay, so is it safe to say that there are a lot of facets to the concept of supermajorities? Do you feel a bit of whiplash going back and forth between these advantages and disadvantages? Like most things in life, we find that the concept of supermajority rule is neither inherently good or bad. It's far more complicated. Supermajority requirements can create a fair playing field for the constituents in a democracy, but it can also diminish the democratic process itself. Initially, when I wrote this talk, I went through each of these advantages and disadvantages and included a historical example for each one. This created two problems. The first was that this talk was going to be over 40 minutes long, and none of you want that. The second problem is that the examples became really repetitive. Almost everyone, with the exception of constitutional amendments and impeachments, was a result of a single aspect of our governance that requires a supermajority. Any guesses? It's the filibuster. So many pieces of key legislation, including Bush's 2001 tax cuts, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act 2009, Affordable Care Act of 2010, were dramatically impacted and their scope limited due to the need to overcome the filibuster. Others, such as the Cap and Trade Bill of 2009 to address climate change, the Gun Control Bill of 2013, and various attempts to pass the DREAM Act, have failed entirely due to their inability to overcome the filibuster's 60-vote requirement, despite having majority support. Even more initiatives have failed simply due to the threat of filibuster alone. President Trump's first-term goals of repealing the ACA, Obamacare, is one example of that. Surprisingly enough, the filibuster, often considered a foundational feature of the Senate, was not part of our founders' original vision. It was an accident. That, however, is a story for a different talk. In wrapping this talk up, requiring a supermajority can provide stability, protect minority interests, and force collaboration, but it can also lead to gridlock, empower minorities to block progress, dilute decision-making, and slow down urgent action. It can also erode the democratic process itself by giving certain options more weight than others. The challenge lies in striking the right balance. Supermajorities can protect against rash decisions, but they can also make it hard to get things done when time is of the essence. They encourage careful consideration, but the cost of increased complexity and the potential for voter disengagement. Ultimately, whether they serve us well depends on the context and how they're applied. Thank you for your time.